All right, so in this final lesson in Unit 3, we're going to look at how random numbers can be used within a game and how we actually can use and access the random number class that is built into MonoGame. So, just as expected, the random number class allows you to essentially create random numbers and to use random numbers in a game. And this is helpful in a game because there are times that you want to add a feeling of randomness into the game, such as when you are rolling a dice, shuffling a deck, maybe selecting a random number. Maybe you need to select a random amount of health to have increased or decreased. Maybe you need to select a random number of lives that a player acquires. So anytime you want a random number, you can use the random class to generate what appears to be a random number within your game. We're going to talk about how we access that random class and then how we can use it to create a random number effect in our games. So in order to use random numbers within our game, the first thing we need to do is we need to globally create a random object at the start of our game. So there is a built-in class called the random class, and we can create an object from that class. And you'll notice that this object declaration with instantiation looks very similar to the objects we declared last chapter. And you'll notice that we can create a random object. You can name this here whatever you want. I tend to go with something like rand so I know what I'm accessing. We have a new random object and it takes in no parameters. So that is our object declaration with instantiation. And something to note, and this is start underneath, is you only need one random object in each program. So even if you're going to generate 10 different random numbers, you only need one object because this same object can be called on numerous times to generate as many random numbers as we want throughout the program. So note, you only need one. You don't need to create 5 random objects. You should only have one. Now, when we generate a random number, we will need to use variables to save that number. And I'll talk about all the different options we have for creating random numbers on the next few slides. But what you'll notice here is that when we create that random number, we should always be saving it inside of a variable. So here I'm creating a random number using the next method, and it's saving inside of num1. Here it's saving inside of num2. So there's really no point in using the random number generator if you don't actually save that value somewhere. So what you'll note on the next few slides is that we are always saving that value inside of a variable. So we have many different built-in methods that we can access and use in the random class. So what you'll notice here is that we use our object name because it is a random object. We will use that object name to access those methods within the random class. And what you'll see is we have quite a few options. So the first one we have is we have methods that will create random integers. Remember, integers are positive and negative whole numbers without the decimal piece to it. Now, the first one that you can use is you can just use .next with no parameters inside. If you put no parameters inside, it will return any random integer. There aren't a lot of uses for this. I think most of the time people have a set value of numbers they want to choose from. However, if you really don't care what random number you get, you can use that .next method and it will return any random integer that your heart desires. Now, the second option we have is that we can actually specify a beginning and an end number that we're choosing from. So what you'll notice here is I use the same .next, but I have these parameters of 1 and 7. So this 1 is the first number that I want my random number set to come from. And the second piece, and this is where this is a little tricky, is my largest number plus 1. So what you'll notice here is having .next 1, 7 actually returns integer values between 1 and 6. So what this will return is either a 1, a 2, a 3, a 4, a 5, or a 6. It does not return 7. So that's something to keep in mind, is that that first number is the first of the random numbers that you would like, and then that second piece is essentially one above the largest number. So the other way you can think about this is going from 1 to 7. 7 minus 1 is equal to 6. So you're generating 6 random numbers. Now, while integers are great, sometimes we need the option to generate doubles or numbers with decimals as well. Now doubles are a little bit different because these now contain decimals. So if you look at the last slide we just went through, dot next returned any random integer. Now if you look at this, dot next double with empty parentheses here returns a random number between 0 and 1 that is not included. So essentially what rand dot next double, or my random object dot the next double method with no parameters does, is it returns a number that is larger than 0 but less than 1. So it has all of those values between 0 and 1. It does not return 0 or 1, but it returns all of those values between 0 and 1. Now from here, if you look at this next one down here, this is no different except for the fact that I included a multiplication on the outside. So essentially what that does is it takes this 0 is less than x is less than 1, and it multiplies the highest and the lowest bound by 10. So here we now have still 0, because 0 times 10 is 0, but 0 is less than x is less than 10. So it essentially takes that range of numbers and multiplies it by 10. So doubles are a little bit different because you can include all of those values in between 0 and 1 that have decimals. They are not just integers. So the most common way that I would like you to represent your answers is here with an inequality. So I can see that you recognize, well, 0 and 10 are not included because of this inequality of less than. And you can see that it contains all of the numbers between them. All right, so what I'd like you to do here is you'll notice that I have a random object created called random. So this is my object name, and I'm utilizing a wide variety of methods contained in the random class. So I have dot next with some parameters, just a dot next, just a dot double, a dot next double with a couple of extra constraints onto it. So what I would like you to do is I would like you to describe the set of the random numbers that are created by each below. So pause the video, see if you can determine what random numbers will be sent back into the program, whether it's integers between this and this, or maybe you have a double inequality where x is sandwiched between maybe 0 and 10. So you tell me what that set of random numbers would look like, and then I will move on to the solutions and discuss some common misconceptions on the next slide. All right, so just to recap really quickly on this. First, that first one is generating random numbers between 1 and 19, and it's generating integers. And you'll see I'm very specific. Integers between 1 and 19. That 20 is just telling me that the highest number I'm generating is 1 below 20. Then in number 2, it is all integers. In number 3, I'm starting at 4 and going to 15 minus 1, which is 14, so I'm generating integers between 4 and 14. In number 4, I purposefully made this a little bit tricky. You know that next 1, 5, this piece right here, is generating the numbers 1, 2, 3, or 4. And then essentially what we're doing is we're multiplying each of those by 5. So 1 times 5 is 5. 2 times 5 is 10. 3 times 5 is 15. 4 times 5 is 20. So really what's happening is in this set of numbers, we are only generating the values 5, 10, 15, and 20. So essentially with these, you figure out what numbers am I generating here? Well, that's 1, 2, 3, or 4. And then you multiply each of those by 5 because that 5 is outside of the parentheses there with the method. Then if you look down at number 4, or excuse me, this should be 5, 6, and 7. If you look at number 5, this is generating a double that is between 0 and 1. Note that the inequalities communicate that this number is between 0 and 1, but does not include 0 or 1. Then in this next one, I'm multiplying those values by 100. So now I now go from 0 to 100. And then this last one, again, I was trying to be a little bit tricky to see if you could catch on to it. Essentially what's happening here is we're generating numbers between 0 and 24, but then this plus 10 on the outside asks you to add 10 to each bound. So really we're generating numbers that are between 10 and 34. So there are a couple that are a little bit tricky in there to see if you can actually apply beyond what we've discussed. So at this point, you should hopefully have a solid understanding of, at least if you look at a random object and the method that it's calling, what set of random numbers it will in fact generate. All right, so now that you've actually started making predictions about what random numbers a line of code will create, what I want you to do now is read each situation below. It says, then, once you've read each situation, write a segment of code that will produce the set of random numbers being described. You can assume the following has been declared. So you can assume that this line of code, random, rand equals new random, is declared at the very, very beginning of your program. And then from here, you're going to use that random object to generate a random number. So just for example, to help you out if you're not sure what to do in number 1, says there are 53 people on a football team, return a random number between 1 and 53. So I know that I have my football number. I'm just going to have that be the variable where I save inside of it. I'm saying my football number, assuming it's a variable I've already created, will be, I use my random object, I use the next function to generate a random integer, and then my first value is 1 and my last value is 53, so I know that this would be 54. So I want you to do that same thing with the next 4 problems on your own, and once you are done, you can unpause the video and move on to the next slide to check your answers. All right, so a couple of key things I want to touch on here. First, number 2, remembering that this is our starting value and this is our ending value plus 1. So we use the dot next method from 20 to 51. Then to return a random decimal between 0 and 15, we know that next double by itself would return 0 to 1. So we then multiply by 15 to expand that to be 0 to 15. Then numbers 4 and 5 I purposefully picked because I thought they were a little bit trickier. So here, if you look at number 4, what it's asking you to do is to generate a random number out of 10, 20, 30, 40, 50, 60, 70. So what I see is that we are generating 7 numbers, essentially 10, 20, 30, 40, 50, 60, 70. And I see that these are all divisible by 10. And if I divide them all by 10, I get the set of numbers 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. And I know how to generate numbers from 1 to 7 that are integers. And that's what this piece of code does right here. It generates those numbers dot next from 1 to 7 by having those parameters of 1 to 8. And then what it does is it takes those values 1 through 7, and after they've been generated, it multiplies them by 10. So as it does this, when it multiplies them by 10, these become 10, 20, 30, 40, 50, 60, 70, and so on. Now this last one is a little bit trickier as well. It says return a random decimal value between 12 and 17. So essentially, I can see that I have a range of 5 numbers. I know that 17 minus 12 is equal to 5. So essentially what I need is I need all the values between 0 and 5, and then I need to add 12 to each. So I have to think through how I'm going to get random decimals between 0 and 5, and then I have to add that 12 on at the end, and that's exactly what I've done here. I have dot next double times 5, which will generate those numbers from 0 to 5, and then what I've done at the end is I've added 12 to each. So this becomes 12 is less than x is less than 17, which is the range that I'm looking for. So make sure that you're able to tackle not just the easier problems up above, but the more challenging ones down below where you have maybe a more specific set of values that you are trying to specifically generate. So at this point, you can move on to the next video that will take you into Monogame so that you can actually practice coding with random numbers and see them work in your games. And then after that, you can move on to the 2 assignments for lesson 3.